Margaret had been married for years, but her world shattered the day she discovered her husband had secretly impregnated their nanny. But let me start from the beginning. Margaret and David had been married for 11 years, 11 years of building a life together, brick by careful brick. Their home was beautiful, tastefully decorated, always smelling of fresh flowers and expensive candles. From the outside, they looked like the couple everyone envied. David was a successful architect. Margaret ran a boutique marketing firm from home. They had everything, except the one thing Margaret wanted most: a child. After years of trying, of medications and procedures and disappointments that carved out pieces of her heart, they'd decided to pause. To breathe, Margaret could focus on her work, and David could focus on his projects. That's when Grace came into their lives. She was 23, soft-spoken, with eyes that never quite met yours. She came from the village with excellent references and a desperate need for employment. Margaret had felt sorry for her. She'd insisted they give her the job, despite David's initial hesitation. "She seems vulnerable," David had said that first day, watching Grace unpack her small bag in the help quarters. Margaret had smiled at him then, touched his arm. "That's exactly why we should help her," she'd reply. If only she'd understand what he really meant. The first few months were peaceful. Grace cleaned, cooked, and kept to herself. She was efficient, almost invisible. Margaret appreciated her quiet presence. David seemed to appreciate it too, though Margaret noticed he'd started coming home earlier, lingering in the kitchen when Grace was preparing dinner, offering to drive her to the market on weekends when Margaret was busy with client calls. "You're being so kind to her," Margaret had mentioned one evening, watching him hand Grace money for groceries. "Just trying to make her feel welcomed," he'd replied, not meeting her eyes. "She's far from home." The cracks started small, a glance that lasted too long. David's phone face down on the table more often than not. Grace's suddenly unable to look at Margaret directly, her hands trembling slightly when serving tea. Then came the morning sickness. Margaret noticed it first during breakfast, 3 months after Grace had started working for them. The girl had rushed from the kitchen, hand over her mouth, her face pale as moonlight. When she returned, David was already standing, a glass of water in his hand, concern etched across his features in a way Margaret hadn't seen directed at her in years. "You should rest," he'd told Grace gently. "Margaret won't mind if you take the morning off." Margaret mind. Not the time off, but the tenderness in his voice, the way his hand had briefly touched Grace's shoulder, the way Grace had looked at him not with gratitude but with something else, something that made Margaret's blood run cold. She began to watch, to observe, to collect the small pieces of evidence that her life had become a carefully constructed lie. David started working late more often. Grace started wearing looser clothing. There were whispered phone calls David took in the garage, the garden, anywhere but inside the house where Margaret might overhear. And then there were the pills, prenatal vitamins Margaret found hidden at the back of Grace's bathroom cabinet when she'd gone in to replace towels. The ultrasound picture was the final piece. Margaret found it on a Tuesday afternoon. Grace had left her apron on the kitchen counter, and when Margaret picked it up to hang it properly, something fell out. A small black and white image, a tiny curved shape floating in darkness. On the back, written in David's unmistakable handwriting, 8 weeks, our miracle. Our miracle. Margaret stood in that kitchen, the photograph trembling in her hands, and felt something inside her calcify, not break, calcify, hard and cold and completely still. She didn't scream, she didn't cry, she didn't confront. Instead, she carefully placed the photograph back into the apron pocket exactly where she'd found it. She smoothed the fabric down, and then she went upstairs, sat in her vanity, and stared at her own reflection until she could see it clearly, this new version of herself, the one who'd been made a fool, the one who'd welcomed the woman carrying her husband's child into her home, the one who'd given her broken heart's hope to this man who'd planted his seed in someone else. That evening, David came home with flowers, roses, Margaret's favorites. "For my beautiful wife," he'd said, kissing her forehead with lips that surely kissed Grace's, just because. Margaret had smiled, thanked him, arranged the roses in a crystal vase while he showered, and she'd felt absolutely nothing. The following days were a performance. Margaret moved through her routines with perfect precision. She smiled at David over breakfast, she thanked Grace for her work, she attended her client meetings and returned to a house that no longer felt like hers, occupied by two people living a secret life right in front of her. But Margaret was watching, always watching. She saw how David's hand would brush against Grace's when he thought Margaret wasn't watching, how he'd slip her extra money whispering that it was for doctor's appointments, how Grace had started touching her stomach unconsciously, that universal gesture of early pregnancy, before catching herself and dropping her hand. Margaret learned their patterns. David left for work at 7:30. Grace went to her quarters to rest every day at 3, when Margaret was usually on conference calls. They texted constantly. Margaret had seen David's phone light up with messages from a contact saved simply as G. And Margaret began to plan. Not from anger, she told herself, not from rage, but from a cold, clear place that understood something fundamental. There were only two ways this could end. Either Margaret walked away from 11 years of her life, destroyed and humiliated, or she found another path, a quieter path. She researched methodically. Incognito browsers, cleared histories, burner email accounts. The internet was full of information if you knew where to look, and Margaret had always been excellent at research. She learned about medications, about complications, about the untraceable ways a pregnancy could simply end. It took 2 weeks to acquire what she needed, another week to find the right moment. That moment came on a Friday evening. David had called to say he'd be late, a client dinner he couldn't miss. Margaret knew better. Grace was in her quarters, resting as usual. The house was quiet. Margaret made tea. Earl Grey, the way Grace liked it, with 2 sugars and a splash of milk. She carried it on a tray to Grace's door and knocked softly. "Come in," Grace's voice, small and uncertain. Margaret entered to find the girl lying on her bed, one hand on her stomach. Their eyes met, and for a moment something passed between them. Understanding, perhaps, or recognition. 2 women caught in the same man's web. "I thought you might like some tea," Margaret said calmly, setting the tray on the bedside table. "You've been working so hard." Grace's eyes dropped to the tea. Her hand moved protectively over her stomach again. "Drink it while it's hot," Margaret encouraged gently. "It'll help you feel better." For a long moment, Grace just stared at the cup. Then slowly she reached for it, brought it to her lips, drank. Margaret watched every sip. "Thank you, ma'am," Grace said again, when the cup was empty. "You're welcome," Margaret replied, taking the tray. "Rest well." She left the room, closed the door, and walked back to her own